If there's any questions or any comments at any point in the lecture, I'd like for this to be conversational, so feel free to interrupt me, interject. And of course, please let me know if there's anything that goes wrong with the screen share. So today what I want to do is I want to present a few projects from the last 6 months. I started my practice about a year ago. But first what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about monumentality in archaeology. I have a background in classical archaeology and architecture, so I'll begin with that. So first and foremost, my name is Caleb Lightfoot. I finished my master's in architecture almost 5 years ago now, which is crazy. While I was in grad school in Texas, I started working with classical archaeologists, and that has been my primary output in the field. I've participated in several field seasons on an island called Samuthrace, which I'll talk about in depth here in a little bit. So that's a little bit about me and my background. The name of my practice is Acephalous Architectures. And again, it's brand new. I think I started it around this time last year. And I want to just briefly explain what what these two words mean. Acephalous is a Greek word that means headless. And I won't go into the origins of that term too much. It's taken from the writings of George Bataille, which I don't think I should talk about here. But I really like this idea of headlessness, especially when you add it to the word architectures, which architecture, if you break it down etymologically, means, master builder, right? So what happens when you have a headless master builder? And so part of the idea that I'm exploring in this work is how the process of architecture, as informed by my work in archaeology, can be completely open, where there's a sort of lack of authorship, or maybe an exploration in who is it that builds and maintains architecture. So first, what I want to do, I'm going to talk about monuments. As you probably guessed from the title of the lecture and the image that I shared on the poster, we'll be talking a lot about American politics, and I'm going to go through some ideas just to sort of set the stage for how my work is responding to those themes. So we'll talk about monumentality first. And then I want to talk about a concept called anastylosis. Anastylosis is another Greek word. It means building again. And it's a process in archaeology for rebuilding ancient monuments. And so we'll unpack that a little bit after I talk about monuments. All right, so I want to begin the monument portion with 3 questions. The first is, most basically, what comes to mind when I say monument? And I want to give you a second to think and sort of conjure in your mind, the idea of a monument. I'm curious if it looks something like this. This is the monument to Francis Scott Key here in San Francisco. One of my main projects I'll be showing tonight is sort of rethinking this monument. But I'm just curious if this sort of fits a preconceived notion about what a monument is, right? We have a neoclassical facade. We have a sort of enthroned historic figure. We have references to Greco-Roman antiquity. This is a little silly, but just doing a quick Google search for monuments kind of reveals some of this idea. As you can see by the images at the top here, monumentality is a major question right now in the US as we're sort of dealing with the racist history of this country and sort of trying to restructure those systems. But also, when you think about monuments, you think of historic architecture. You think of buildings that belong to other historic ages. Something I'd like to argue, which will form sort of the basis of this lecture, is that this idea of monumentality is itself a construction. Okay, so this is a famous etching by Piranesi. I'm sure you're all familiar. This is his sort of reimagining of the Appian Way. And I think in that beautiful Piranesi style of rendering the dark sides of the architectural imagination, I think this sort of conjures up an idea of monumentality, right? We have this sort of appeal to Roman antiquity. There's something funerary, right? It's like enshrining dead figures in some way. Something, however, anybody familiar with architectural history will know, is that is that this process emerged around the same time as the birth of the field of archaeology. So this is a painting by Thomas Cole, which is sort of a more sunny version of the Piranesi etching. And it's part of this idea that the history of architecture is a history of progress, right? We sort of begin in the far distant past with the monuments of Egypt, and then there's a progression through the Greek monuments, the Roman monuments, up to the British and American monuments. Okay, so if that first image I showed you of the Francis Scott Key Monument, if that fit your sort of stereotype of what a monument is, I think that's because that is, very deliberate construction in our field. That the history of architecture is construed as a progression through monuments from antiquity, in which the classical monument sort of plays an important, maybe even eternal symbolic role. This is an image of Sir John Soane's museum room. Interestingly enough, I found this image in the Epic Times. I don't know if you're familiar with that publication. It's a very, it's a xenophobic Breitbart, but I think that I love this image, and of course all of Sir John Soane's work, but I think it shows how at the beginning of architectural history, as it began to emerge, it was inextricably linked with the birth of archaeology and sort of these thinkers and theorists and aristocrats going to Greece and Rome and trying to resurrect this idea of antique democracy and then tie it directly to British and American identity. Okay, so again, if we're thinking about monuments as symbols, I think that there's a very clear lineage in sort of in the way that neoclassical symbols play into that. All right, so my second question for the night is, what makes and sustains them? If we're thinking about monuments as symbols, then the next question is, how does a monument form from raw material, right? So how do we get from marble to monument? The most literal answer, of course, is human work, right? This is a historic photo of the Washington Memorial being built in Washington, D.C. I was initially going to talk a little bit more about the relationships between labor that create monuments. It's a little bit outside the scope of this, but I think it's important to realize that, of course, monuments are built by humans, right? However, what I really want to focus on with this is the structures of power that maintain them. So throughout this lecture, I'm going to show a lot of images from the George Floyd uprising over the summer. I'm sure following the news, there was, one of the biggest mass uprisings in American history. And of course, all over the world. I know there were protests all over as well. This is an image of two policemen guarding a controversial monument in Washington, D.C. So something that I'd like to point out is that here in America, national identity is very linked to our neoclassical monuments. And in fact, they actually encode a very racist history, right? If we're thinking about the birth of architectural history, sort of reclaiming those ancient ruins, how they've been used in American history is to sort of prop up white nationalist identity. So, of course, over the summer, monuments became a big topic of discourse. In fact, this is a quote from an executive order that Donald Trump tried to have passed last year, which Joe Biden recently overturned. But interestingly enough, he tried to make an executive order specifying that every new federal building would be built in a neoclassical style. This is a quote from that executive order where he's sort of talking about and romanticizing the foundings of America, right? And how we've modeled our most important buildings off the classical architecture of ancient Athens and Rome. All right, so this idea is basically intrinsic to the establishment of American monuments. All right, so here's a photo of Trump posing in front of Mount Rushmore. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Mount Rushmore was designed by a literal Nazi, and it was carved into a mountain that's very sacred to the Lakota peoples. And Donald Trump referenced it quite a few times throughout his presidency as, this is one of the greatest American monuments, and we need to preserve it and maintain it. In fact, I'm sure for all of you who followed the news from the last year know, Donald Trump spent a lot of time, more time, talking about how important it is we honor our monuments than it is facing, racial and social justice issues. Okay, so my third question is, what is to be done with it? So to recap, I began this by sort of talking about like the idea of a monument, a symbol, and then we talked about a little bit of what makes and sustains them in specific regards to state power in America as a way of forming a nationalist identity. Now, a question that's been being asked by lots of people in our culture right now is what is to be done with them? Okay, so here's an image, and something that will form the basis of the projects that I show is how do we reverse the process, right? If there's a whole process of human work and state power that creates the monument symbol out of raw materials, how can we reverse that? Can we turn monuments back into raw material? And how could this function as a way of rethinking how we redesign our society as a whole? This is a drawing, not my own, it's from Reuters. This is a map of the 1,500 extant Confederate monuments in the US. I'm from West Texas. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the American South, but if you've ever spent much time there, the idea of the Confederacy is still very strong, right? And I don't know if perhaps you know this, but the majority of Confederate monuments were not built in the immediate wake of the Civil War. They were actually built in the early 20th century to sort of shore up white nationalist identity. So this is a statue dedicated to Robert E. Lee in Richmond, and this is sort of the dedication back in 1912. So what is to be done? This is one of my all-time favorite images I'll be sharing with you tonight. Over the summer, right, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. And one of the things that happened was protesters attacked monuments. They pulled down statues, they effaced them with cans of spray paint. And what I think is most remarkable is that they took over these sites and they introduced new types of social gatherings. So for instance, this Robert E. Lee statue is situated in the middle of a sort of fenced off green lawn. And these protesters here, they, wheeled in a basketball hoop, right, to sort of play basketball. And to me, I think that's incredibly beautiful because it's a way of taking back that space. Some of the things I'll be exploring in my own work that I'm sharing tonight is what's the next step, okay? After this massive uprising, after this sort of reconciliation, how can we push this a step further? All right, here's another image. This is protesters sort of completely spontaneously tearing down a monument to Andrew Jackson. Okay, so now I want to talk about the idea of anastylosis. All right, so setting aside the brief overview of monuments, which we'll come back to, I want to go to archaeology first, okay? So anastylosis is a process in archaeology for rebuilding ancient monuments. You're probably all familiar with this is, iconic, of course, if you've ever been there. The Parthenon is the subject of an ongoing work of anastylosis. And they've been working on it for a long time. And I actually have a friend who has a friend who is one of the leads of this project. And I know from talking with him that, the amount of precision and work that goes into this is just astounding, right? I mean, they measure every single block. I mean, they actually laser measured every single block down to the micromillimeter to figure out where it goes. So what I want to point out is that within the process of archaeology, anastylosis is a very precise process for rebuilding mostly Hellenistic monuments, although it can be used in other ways. But one thing that I want to explore, and we're about to jump into my own work on Samuthrace, is what is the process that allows for that construction, right? There's a whole world of work and of media that is created and made that makes rebuilding possible. And something I would like to argue is looking back at our earlier conversation about monuments, it's inextricably linked with this idea of the glorified Greco-Roman past, okay? So something that I'm wondering about in my work is if we can subvert and challenge that a bit. All right, so let's jump to Samothrace. Samothrace is a beautiful little island in the North Aegean Sea, and it's home to an ancient religious sanctuary. Here it is, you can see it at the top of the screen, sort of all the way up north. The cult that existed on Samothrace was actually one of the religious hubs of the ancient world. It was probably only secondary to the religious cult at Delphi and attracted people from all over. In fact, Alexander the Great's father, Philip, was actually an initiate of the cult. Heraclitus was an initiate. So it's sort of got a very, it plays a very important role in the ancient religious imagination. All right, this is an image from the 1960s from the Samothrace archive. I love this image because I think it sort of taps into that Piranesi, romanticism for ancient ruins. Um, However, something I'll be exploring in this portion of the lecture is all of the things that go into producing the idea of the archaeological site as a Hellenistic site. Okay, so what we're looking at is these four columns that have been erected. This is a work of Anastylosis, and in the 60s they sort of rebuilt these four columns that belong to the Huron, which is here. This is a drawing from the same time period, and as you can see, the drawing sort of has to come first, right? So that therefore the material things can be stacked back up and re-erected. This is my own drawing, and this was kind of a response to several summers of working on the site and thinking about the process of anastylosis. So this is a proposal to rebuild a portion of the ancient stoa. I probably put in over 100 hours on this drawing, not because it's all that complicated, but because archaeologists are very picky about all the details. And so I sort of had to go out and field check every single stone and check the measurements, all those kinds of things. And so anyways, this was a sort of initial study to see, could we rebuild a portion of the ancient stoa? And it's funny because I worked on this on and off for several summers. And when I was working on this project, I wasn't really thinking about all the ideology that goes into this form of anastylosis, and that sort of came after. So something I want to describe to you is how we get from a site to a paper monument like this. This is a picture from 1880. So Samuthrace was first excavated by an Austrian team. In fact, the Austrian team was the first to use photography in an archaeological text. So this is a sort of, I don't have a higher res version of it, but this is an image from 1880. I love this image because it shows the destruction that often goes into producing an archaeological site. So Samothrace, the Hellenistic sanctuary, was sort of out of use by about 100 AD, right? So there's almost 2,000 years worth of accretion on top of that, right? There was a medieval fortress, there was a settlement. When the Austrians come in the 80s, what they do is they basically destroy all of that. So this is a local workman, and he's standing on what used to be a medieval tower, and you can see it sort of thrown off to the side. And then, interestingly enough, they actually built a little rail line and carted all of this stuff and threw it into the ocean. And so if you were to visit Samothrace today and see the site, there's virtually no trace of any post-antique structures that were built on top. And again, I think that's very telling because, at the birth of archaeology, there is a desire to get back to that idealized Hellenistic Greco-Roman past. All right, this is another image from the 1960s, so 80 years later. And I like that you can see how much in 80 years has been transformed, right? The topography of the site has been completely changed. And basically, at this point, everything except the Hellenistic has been removed from the site and destroyed, okay? So how do we get from here, all the excavated building blocks, to the monument? Well, after all the work that is put in by mostly local workmen, sort of moving these 1,800 excavated building blocks, we get to a block field. This is a GIS sort of export I did really quickly, just to show how each of the blocks is assigned a number, and then they're arranged in grids. And so the reason that this happens is so that every subsequent field season, the archaeologists can return and find the exact blocks they're looking for. Okay, so here at the Stoa, for instance, There's over 1,800 excavated building blocks. Now, what happens is that a handful of them, in this case around 100, will get transformed into architectural drawings. So this is one of my own drawings, and something that I want to pause and reflect on is that this is what you'll see in publication, right? You'll see these drawings of blocks, you'll see the drawings of the monuments, and it sort of obscures all of the work, all of the labor that went into producing this drawing, as well as all of the other states at the site that were systemically destroyed or dismantled. All right, so I haven't showed you a map of the sanctuary because I wanted to walk you through that process of how the monument is made and the media that goes into making it. So this is a map of the sanctuary, sort of imagining it in an idealized Hellenistic time. As you can see, there's no reference to any of the post-antique structures. In fact, I don't think there's a single drawing that's been made that shows the sanctuary in any other state but this, except for one. This is a map that was drawn by the first French explorers who went there. I call them explorers very loosely. They were there to take treasure, right? Because this is where they found the winged Nike of Samuthrace. I love this map because it shows the site as it existed before the process of archaeology began, okay? So looking at the stoa, which is that long foundation in the bottom left of the screen, you can see in those kind of thickened pochés, you can see the medieval tower, what it looks like a medieval wall. Up at the top of the screen, you can see traces of a Byzantine fortress. And again, all of that is gone. So before coming back to America and talking about monumentality again, I want to show one more image from Samothrace. And this is one I took the last summer I was there. This is sort of like looking over the fence that separates the archaeological site from the rest of the island. Something that I think is really interesting that this photo reveals is the way that the archaeological site has to become its own sort of secured island, right? Sort of removed from the flow of time. For instance, Samothrace has some fairly severe ecological problems right now. They have about 200,000 goats and only 2,000 people. And the goat population is destroying some of the old growth forests. So, you know, they have issues that they're dealing with as a community, trying to preserve their ecosystem. And I think something you can see in this photo is the ecological difference between the archaeological site and the rest of the island, right? By putting a fence, by only having one entry point, it's sort of pulling the site out from the rest of the culture, the rest of the island's ecosystem. And archaeological sites have to function that way in order to produce monuments. They have to sort of arrest or freeze the things that are found in a very particular way so that then you can build up this reconstructed past, which in this case is that idealized Hellenistic past. Okay, so having looked at Samothrace and sort of going through the process of anastylosis, how it works within the context of the discipline of archaeology, I want to now go to San Francisco. Okay, so we've seen this before. This is the monument to Francis Scott Key. And so the impetus for this project was around 6 months ago, I was invited to participate in a media lab with other local artists, sort of reimagining one of San Francisco's public monuments, particular ones that were built to honor white supremacists. So for those of you who don't know, Francis Scott Key was the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, which in its original form has a very racist verse. And of course, Francis Scott Key himself was a slave owner. So the point of departure for this particular project begins with a simple question. Okay, so as people all over the country and all over the world are demanding that we take down these sculptures to, you know, racist historical figures, my question beginning this project was, what happens next, right? As we've been looking at so far, there's a very deliberate attempt to reconstruct a Hellenistic past as a part of American identity, right? Particularly white nationalist identity. So my take was that simply removing the figure doesn't actually change the monument as symbol. That even the neoclassical architecture itself is sort of encoding those ideas. All right, so this is a map of Golden Gate Park. All the monuments that each artist chose were in the music concourse, which is up here at the top right of the screen. Um, Important to note here, Golden Gate Park was one of the first big parks that was built in San Francisco. It was a series of sand dunes on Ohlone land prior to that. And in order to construct the park, they basically had to completely terraform it. There was a huge population of local bison that lived there, and they basically killed them all and sort of scraped every living thing off the site and built the park. So, starting out this project, I was thinking, can we think of this as an archaeological site? I think there's an interesting parallel between the archaeological site and the park, whereas it sort of has to be preserved and maintained and taken out of the flow of the ecosystem that might exist in any place. All right, this is a sort of image that I made at the very beginning of this project. And this is an overlay of 4 historic images of the Francis Scott Key Monument. Something that I want to point out is that out of the 5 or 6 photos I've overlaid here, they were taken across 80 years of time from 4 different vantage points. And also, the monument was actually existed in 2 or 3 different locations around the park in each of these photographs. Something that I think is really interesting, though, is that despite the spatial location of the monument, despite the angle at which the photograph was taken from, when you overlay them, the monument as symbol emerges. And I think that's because the monument in this way is designed that no matter what side you're looking at it from, that symbolic quality comes through. Okay. So something that I began thinking about was, what can you do with the monument as symbol, right? How do we move beyond it, especially when that symbol is alluding to a racist history? Again, just to sort of tie things back to this ancient Hellenistic idea, I can't find a direct reference, but I think that it's very clear that the architecture of this monument in some ways references the tetrapylon of Palmyra. Okay, so this is the moment. I think I love this photo so much. This was taken during the George Floyd uprisings over the summer by a protester. And essentially, this is vigilantes tearing down the sculpture. And something that I'd like to argue is that, and this is the moment that we're going through, um, in all of these states prior, right, over this 80 years of history, the monument basically remains unchanged, even when it moves to different locations. But to me, this moment here is an introduction into a new kind of historical time, one in which that symbolic power is suddenly ruptured, and the monument sort of enters the material flow again. It'd be like if all of a sudden the fences came down at the archaeological site on Samuthrace, right? What happens when the site is re-emerged back into the flows of time and culture? Okay, so this is what I'm calling that historical time, right? Where the symbol sort of exists, you don't question it. You look at the monument, you see the symbol. This is what I call the effacement. And this is what we've been looking at prior. This is sort of where the symbol begins to be questioned, right? Protesters pull down the sculpture. They sort of, cover the monument in tags. And I think this is a really important step. All right, so now I wanted to imagine what would be the next step beyond this, okay? I call it the revolutionary, which, that can happen in a number of ways. It can happen by deliberate destruction. It can happen by abandonment over the course of time. But I think this is the moment where the monument begins to become material again. Although in order to get to this step, I think you have to have the effacement, where the monument loses its symbolic context. All right, now this is what I call the archaeological. And the reason I've included this is because, and I didn't mention this when we were talking about Samothrace, but I think that we should view the work of archaeology as one type of time within all the others, right? So archaeology isn't the final moment where everything's been sorted, the past has been reconstructed. It's one more phase in the material state of a site. So in this project, I was imagining, okay, if the symbolic order has been shattered and then the monument itself is deconstructed, could you sort the pieces again using the methodologies of archaeology with the goal of rebuilding something new? Okay, so I'm calling this anastylosis. However, I think that what we can do is we can introduce new media, new ideas to rebuild these monuments in ways that reference a changing world and a changing society. All right, so these are four plates exploring that same idea in isometric. So this is that moment where the racist figure has been pulled down. Then we have the ruin. Then we have the archaeological, which is where I imagine the pieces being sorted, measured, and then could we imagine a new state? Again, going back to my overall practice idea about headless architectures, I'd like to say that this is a very soft suggestion for what could happen. What I'm imagining is that all of this work would be done by the people, right? This could even happen within the period of a day, right, where the thing is destroyed and sorted. And then this could be one of hundreds of potential reconstructions, right? Where you sort of reuse the pieces. Here it's sort of existing sort of on the scaffolding. I was imagining a type of playfulness to it, that this thing that used to be a solid monument is now inverted, it's hollowed out. It's a space for people to gather, voice their opinions maybe. I was also thinking with this too, if you've ever been to the Bay, you know that people out here love graffiti, they love to tag surfaces. So maybe that this could also be interactive in that way, right? Where people could paint on these surfaces, that there could be a sort of openness to it. Okay, so that is one of my most recent projects. I want to now go to the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina and explore this idea a little bit more, although from a slightly different perspective. This is an image I made, sort of stylized, of looking at one of the trails. So the impetus for what happened is, for this project, is the Pisgah National Forest is one of the oldest growth forests in the U.S. It's on Cherokee land, and currently there's a conversation happening between local residents about how to make the trail system more accessible to the local population. These trails attract a lot of tourists. It also attracts, a lot of people who just go to these trails and use them to sort of go for runs, or go on hikes to see, from point A to point B. But one of the conversations that began to happen was, how can we make these trails more accessible, giving places to reflect, think about the history of how this site is produced. And so what happened is that one of my archaeological colleagues approached me and said, we've received this commission from the local community. Would you like to be involved? So again, thinking about how sites are produced, this is an image of one of the civilian conservation corps dwelling structures that was built. So for those of you who don't know, during the Great Depression, there was something called the CCC that was formed here in the States. And the idea was to create employment for a lot of young people. And they built most of the national park systems in the US during this time period. So it's interesting because when you go to Pisgah, you can still see the traces of that construction process. And again, one of the things we were thinking about is how can you return aspects of this site to the flow of time and culture. So what was presented to me was the prompt to design a series of monuments for one of the trail systems. And the monuments were going to exist in a way where there would sort of be gathering spaces around them, information about that trail, about its history, including all the dark parts of its history, the peoples that were displaced, for instance, would be sort of inscribed onto the surfaces of the monument itself. This was the very first drawing I made, kind of exploring this idea. And after reflecting on this drawing, I realized that it was a little bit idealized, and that I hadn't really begun to consider what actually exists on site and can we reuse some of the materials that are there. Okay, so going back to thinking about um, the traces of construction that went into producing this site, you know, I thought, could you use, stacked stone? Maybe even some of the stacked stone from the ruined structures there. Okay, so this was the first monument. And as you can see, the text would be inscribed on the surface. Um, Something else I want to note about these drawings is that they're intended to be, again, very soft suggestions. And what we're planning on doing is later this year or early next year, going and sort of having a community forum and sort of completely opening up to the community to see what it is they would like to build. And if there's any media we can offer or resources in that way, that's great. All right, the second monument, which was going to occur at the sort of crest of the trail, I was wondering if you could just use one of the monolithic stones on site there. The third, out of wood. Whoops, sorry, I reversed the order of this. This one is supposed to go with this. This one, we were imagining could be built out of aluminum from a local manufacturing plant to sort of reflect a waterfall. And then finally, imagining one built out of wood. So something else I'd like to mention about this project, and I'll just scroll back through these slides as I do. One of the things we were thinking about too is not having a map of where they exist. And so what would happen is that as you're walking along the trail, you sort of stumble upon them. So in that way, maybe the monument can be its own mapping of the site. And it's not a place that you're trying to get to. You sort of come across it, you pause, you reflect, and then you keep going on the trail. Also, something else that's important to note is that even the information we're planning on inscribing on the surfaces is intended to be a community effort. And so what we're planning on doing is, again, opening up a forum and saying, what history do you want to share about this site? And also representing all the diverse voices that go into this place. All right, so I want to show one more project, and this is going to Minneapolis. As you know, last year, right around this time, there was a murder that was televised that completely shook the world, right? I'm sure we all saw the horrendous video of George Floyd being murdered by a police officer. And of course, as you all know, from recent news, that officer was convicted, thank goodness. But yeah, this is a moment that really shook the country again. And, in the thousands of people that took to the streets in the wake of that, questions started emerging about, well, I mean, like, what is to be done? Okay, like, so we've got this system that sort of encodes white supremacy, both culturally and also on the state level. And what can we do about that? So this is the intersection where that murder occurred. And something that I was really struck by as I was thinking about this project was that the site where this happened became something of an impromptu sacred space. Um, as you can see, there's like a ring of flowers placed around. The center was kind of preserved as like a shrine. And in fact, reading descriptions from people who were there on site, with all the chaos that was raging around the country and in the protests, this place was eerily calm, and it was filled with also like dancing and laughter, and so that there was even something celebratory about it, where people from the neighborhood who had just witnessed this terrible thing sort of took over this intersection and claimed it as a space for themselves, as a space for their community. Okay, but what happens, right? The city wants its intersection back. And so these same protesters had drafted a list of, I think it was 14 demands, in which they were asking for, new resources channeled back into their community, money for schools. They wanted a complete reform of the Minneapolis police. What does the city do? The city says, no, we're not going to do any of those things. Give us our intersection back and we'll rename it. Okay, so this is a sort of symbolic concession when the people are demanding a material change. So this drawing I made, I actually made this for a competition. I don't know if you're all familiar with the non-architecture platform. I highly recommend it. I think it's great for students too. But the competition was asking for a new type of democratic assembly. And so what I was imagining is, at first I was thinking, okay, what kind of monument could enshrine this place as a space for radical revolutionary change? And I thought, well, I think what should happen is that this intersection should not be given back to the city. Instead, it should be torn up, that the flows of traffic should be disrupted, the flows of capital, and it should be built into a democratic assembly space where people from the local neighborhood could come and make decisions about how resources should be distributed in their community. So going back to a theme that I think unites all of these projects is the idea of accelerating the flow of time and the flow of material, right? So even with this drawing, I was imagining that the new monument itself would be built out of the rubble from the street, right? And so that there would be this sort of mass movement where people tear up the street and sort of reorganize it spontaneously into a series of gathering spaces. So here are a few details from that drawing. I was thinking that the center of this gathering space could be perhaps like a pile of rubble from the street. So it's a sort of way of preserving, like, this is the world that was, and now we're entering a new historical time. Again, here's a few other details. Thinking about different types of gathering spaces that could occur there. And since they're built out of rubble from the site as it is now, my thought was that they could be completely reorganized spontaneously to adapt to new programs, new needs. Okay, here's one more. Here's another detail. All right, so as I've approached the end of this presentation, I want to also mention the Minnesota Freedom Fund. Because this last project was talking about Minneapolis and ongoing struggles for justice there, if anyone is so interested, I highly recommend checking out this group. They sort of post bail for the wrongfully incarcerated. They offer free legal counsel to minority communities that can't afford them. So if anyone's interested, feel free to go check it out, donate, anything like that. If I also have a list of other charities and resources if anyone's interested in that. So, okay, thank you so much. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Gil. That was amazing. Such an interesting presentation. I guess I never really thought about the way monuments evolve and how they can be rebuilt. So it was really refreshing. Thank you very much.
Great.
And I guess we're gonna open up for questions. So if anyone has any questions, you could put them into the chat. We can speak up. I'm gonna get things started with asking you, what do you think about the cultural importance of where the material comes from, the material that the monument is being built from?
Oh, okay. So let me see if I understand. So you're saying about like the actual raw materials?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, actually, so something that I wanted to include in this lecture and I decided to omit because of time and not wanting to be too obtuse, but um, I wanted to talk a little bit about some sociological theories about how labor is structured and sort of thinking about how monuments are produced. So, for instance, I think it's really important to remember that, yeah, monuments are built by workers, and that there's systems and contradictions that generate those relationships that produce those sites. Um, so so I guess to answer your question in two parts, I think like rethinking about the raw materials of monuments can remind us of the human labor and the workforce that built it, and then could empower us for that same workforce to build it in a new way, in a way that works for them, in a way that is democratic. Okay, so that's one answer. Um, the second answer, which is a little more complicated, is I don't want to get in trouble, but thinking about the archaeological site, I'm actually a big proponent of the idea that archaeological sites should be reused. So, for instance, on Samothrace, um, there's a really dark inscription from one of the journals from the 60s where they talk about how the ancient theater was excavated and that local rabble took the building blocks to build new houses. And to me, I mean, talk about exposing your racism, right, and like European colonial identity. But to me, people have been reusing stone for lots of human history. Um, I was worried about time. I was going to end this lecture with some images again from Samuthrace, showing a 19th century church that was built out of rubble from the sanctuary, with the suggestion that humans through most of history have been reusing raw materials, right? And that this is not something that is unique, but that I think it's something that is potentially radical in today's context because through the gaze of archaeology and maybe even architectural history, things have become so stratified. Uh, I don't know if that answers your question in any real way, but
No, yeah, yeah, it does. It's a very good answer, and I'm actually starting to think about like even importing materials and how that affects the people that are building it, or the importance, or the like the purpose and everything.
absolutely. And I think one of the beautiful things about archaeology as a discipline is that it could reveal those relationships. And there are some archaeologists that are focused on that, that are focused on human labor and how human labor produces sites and sort of trying to do a more working class based analysis of history, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we have a question in the chat. So Danny's asking, can the archaeological site be seen as an episode in the life of the building rather than a separate concept?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it has to, because it exists, right? We can't pretend it doesn't exist, nor should we. I'm certainly not going to say that there's not any values from the discipline of archaeology and sort of, sharing history of these sites with the world. Um, but yeah, I think that would be the question that I'm grappling with in my work is what comes next? If the archaeological site is just one state in an ongoing flux of states, what would be the next step? And so that's why I'm trying to reuse the idea of anastylosis rather than arriving at this is it, this is the monument, this is history incarnate. How do you imagine that as diffuse and in flux?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's part of my PhD thesis, actually, episodes in the lives of buildings, and situating things temporally as rather as well as spatially, but it's like the boundaries between episodes are sort of quite blurred things, isn't it? So as architects, we have to sort of have learn the idea that our job isn't just finished, when the building's finished on site. That's really when the life of the building really takes off. But it's this end of life thing is really interesting as well. When is a building, how does it cycle around? Yes, we can demolish it, we can recycle it. But in the work I was doing, I realized that archaeology is just as valid a phase in the life of the building. And it links to that Howard Carter thing. So, okay, we've got the Hellenistic architecture of the British Museum, so we understand completely what you're saying. But the tomb of Tutankhamun, at what point did it become a monument? At what point was it not actually functioning as it should have been? You know, who decided what when? You know.
You know what? And I would love to talk with you more offline about your research because it sounds super fascinating. But I think that's the starting point of these inquiries. And again, this is all very new, but is like thinking about, could we explicate the process of power and media that creates monuments in any given epoch, right? And so exactly to your point, like, you know, there are institutions, whether it's the institution of the museum or, you know, global tourism trade, which generates the economy for archaeological sites. There are other systems of power that then say this is a monument, this isn't. For instance, going back to Samothrace, one of my friends is a Byzantine scholar in Athens. And when she came to the site, she told me that in her experience, a lot of her fellow, you know, Athenian people born and raised, they felt a sort of ashamed of their medieval or Byzantine history because they had been taught by the Western archaeological gaze that no, what makes your culture valuable as an export is the Hellenistic, is the Greek, right? And so like something that she's working on is like reclaiming Ottoman and medieval history as, you know, a very like beautiful chapter in Greek history, right? So thank you, Danny. Yeah, and I would love to talk to you more.
And there's another question in the chat from Amy. Amy, would you want to unmute yourself and ask it yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm super interested by your research because I've also kind of done some designs of how to kind of recontextualize monuments. We've got this statue called the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. I don't know if you've ever come across it, but I was just wondering, what is your critique of iconoclasm, and do you kind of think this event should occur? Because in the UK, a problem that we've got is that some of the monuments are listed, so it kind of there's a tension between people wanting to pull down monuments and also how do we preserve the history still, because it's kind of, it goes against like planning policy. Should we as architects intervene?
Yeah, so the iconoclasm question is really interesting, and I think all I can do is share my personal opinion because this is a really large conversation, right? And there's some people who think like, okay, we should tear these down, but then maybe put them in museums. We should completely remove them from sight altogether. I'm a little bit more, I think, about the complete dismantling and reuse of everything. I don't particularly see a value in preserving statues of these racist individuals, especially since these materials can be reused. I think that there could be other ways of preserving history. And what I'd like to argue is that history is actually an accretion of material things less than an idea. And so for me, I think that reusing all of the parts of a monument is a very valid form of history, of performing history, right, of that. So that being said, I do understand the idea that, you know, we should preserve them in some sense as historical objects. Again, I say, yes, they're historical objects. History marches on. Let's reuse them. But yeah, that is fairly iconoclastic. So there's I think there's room for more nuance than my answer there.
Yeah, I was just I guess I didn't quite frame it, but I was just wondering, have you considered that for instance, if we take them down, that's kind of subtraction. So we're removing the kind of lessons that we could learn from history. But perhaps like my take is more to recontextualize them. So allow them to remain, but reframe them within their kind of the context of their colonial associations, for instance.
And I think that's perfectly valid. And something like I was trying to explore with the San Francisco project, for instance, was reuse the materials, but reuse it on site. You know, so that you can still reference the fact that this was a monument to Francis Scott Key. In fact, some of those building blocks would still bear those inscriptions, right? but that you could maybe recontextualize it programmatically, architecturally. So I completely agree. I don't necessarily think that you should just completely scrape it and pretend it never happened, but that there could be something more powerful about inhabiting that middle ground where it's maybe been destroyed and reused, but then that site is being held open to draw attention to all of the complexities of that past. So I agree. Yeah.
Great. And there's another question from Mariam. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it yourself, or should I? Okay, I guess I'll just go ahead. So you mentioned that you questioned what to do with the monuments at the beginning. She said she might have missed it, but could you explain what you think should happen for the future with them?
Yeah. And again, I think that is a completely open question, and there's a large conversation about what's going on. In the three projects that I presented here, there's more of a, I hate to say adaptive reuse because that's such a watered down term, but I do think that there is maybe something to explore with reusing the materials, keeping them on site, building something new out of them, a new architectural intervention. But it's an ongoing question. I know some people again think that they should be put in museums. I certainly think another thing I should mention too is that digital technology can also go a long way. For instance, I've got a friend who's working with a museum in the Carolinas that is rematriating its entire collection, which is amazing, and giving it back to all of the indigenous peoples and tribes around the country that these artifacts were taken from. But something that they're doing first and what he's working on is he's making super detailed 3D scans of every object before it goes back. And so that, that archive will kind of exist in a digital space while the material things go back to the peoples they were taken from. And so there is something to consider too with maybe that we could also think about using, digital technologies, AR, that kind of thing, to if you want to see what this was like, there it is, but then you reduce something with the materials. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. And any more questions, anyone? If not, I just want to say that it was amazing to have you, and very refreshing. It certainly gave me a lot of things to think about.
Well, thank you. This was a real treat for me. This is the first time I've presented any of this, and so it's very raw, and I really appreciate it. And thank you for. I've got a lot to think about even with the questions. So thank you.
Oh, I think.
Hi, Caleb. I just wanted to say thank you. Yeah, it was great. It was really good. I have a lot of comments about Greece and archaeology and whose history are we retelling and what kind of history has been exported to the West as Greek.
Yes.
So yeah, we'll pick it up.
Okay.
But it's been really great.
Thank you, Eva. Yeah, and it'll be great to talk to you more about this as well. Thank you.
And thanks to Suas.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much. I'm so thankful for this. Thank you for letting me do this.
I think there's one more question. I think Amy came
Sure.
back with another question. Amy, are you still?
Yeah, sorry, just wanted to ask as well, had you come up, just interested because I've also done something along the same lines, have you come up with alternative ideas for the Samuthrace project? So the one you presented, was that the one that you come up with kind of a number of options and then thought, oh, this is the best one?
You mean in terms of the anastylosis?
Yeah, really fascinating approach though.
Yeah, so not as much because the thing is, when I was working on that project, there was a very prescriptive idea about what the final result should be. So the goal was to reproduce these Hellenistic stoa with as much fidelity as possible. So all of the iterations of that drawing were just basically drafts that were, oh no, this block can't possibly go there. The cuttings are in the wrong place. That kind of thing. I will say what I'd like to work on next, because I've had about a year now away from that project. I'm not formally working on it anymore. And so I would like for my next project to sort of go back to thinking about a different anastylosis for those 1800 building blocks. And I've, there's almost 1,800 people on Samuthrace, right? Like I was thinking like, oh, what happens if, each one of those was distributed or something? But so that is actually something that I'd like to work on next.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Thanks for the great questions.
Okay, I think we can start wrapping it up. So again, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, and these are great conversations. Feel free to send me an email offline if anyone else wants to keep chatting about this. So, yeah, I don't know, I can share my email, or just you can find it from elsewhere.
I think you can share your email in the chat if you want.
Okay, sure. Yeah. But I'd love to keep talking to some of you who are also working on similar ideas. So yeah, feel free to shoot me an email.
Great. So have a nice evening.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Y'all have a wonderful evening. I'm going to start my day now.
Oh yeah, all right.
So thank you to Suas for this. Thank you, Larissa. Thank you, Eva, as well. And yeah, I hope y'all have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.